Good evening, everyone. My name is Zoltán Pogátsa. I am the editor-in-chief of New Equality magazine, one of the organizers of this session today. Together with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, we have been organizing these sessions for years now. We are very grateful for this cooperation. We would like to greet all of you who have joined us tonight for another session. Today we have Professor Dr. Philipp Staab with us. I'm going to introduce him in a moment. Thank you, Philipp, for accepting our invitation. The aim of this series is to basically bring to primarily the Hungarian audience, but in general to the wider FAS audience and the region of Central and Eastern Europe, those thinkers who we believe are very influential in shaping thoughts and ideas about processes which define our present and our future, and to enable the same audience to basically ask questions and debate a little bit with these sort of leading scholars. And that's what we've been doing for a while now. And this is why we have invited Philipp today. I'm just going to say a few words about how this is going to happen so that, we've asked Philipp to hold a sort of preliminary little introduction at the beginning, which will take about 15 minutes, in which he will tell us about his main findings from years and years of research into the topic of the digital economy. The focus we have agreed on is the question, does the digital economy set us free or not? He'll be talking about some other stuff as well, which he has covered in his research. If you have questions as you listen to him give his talk at the beginning, there's two things you can do. One of them is we have a chat window. So if you are too shy to ask a question directly, you can type it into the chat window at the bottom, and I will try to feed it into the conversation. The other thing you can do is you have a raise hand function where the participants are actually right at the bottom also. And if you raise your hands, I have just raised my hands, I've just lowered my hands, you can see this little yellow palm indicating that I want to ask a question. And so just hand the floor over to you and you can ask a question directly afterwards. So those are the two ways of doing it. As far as interpretation is concerned, we have two channels. So if you're listening to us in English and you would like to switch to the Hungarian translation, van magyar fordítás, és a magyar fordításhoz a japánra kell kapcsolni. The Hungarian translation is available. The Japanese, there's no Hungarian in Zoom, unfortunately, so we substituted Japanese. Nincs magyar a Zoomban, ezért a japánon tudják hallgatni a fordítást, a tolmácsolást, hogyha magyarul szeretnének minket hallgatni. You can only ask questions if you are in Zoom, so you need to have registered. If you're following us in the live stream on Facebook, then unfortunately you cannot ask questions. You have to join us on Zoom in order to do that. That, I think, is all the introduction, technically speaking. And now I'd like to say a few words about Professor Staab. I'd like to introduce to you who he is, and he has a very long CV, so it's one of the most complicated introductions that I'll ever have to give. Professor Philipp Staab is Professor of Sociology of the Future at work at Humboldt-University Berlin and at the Einstein Center for Digital Future. He studied a lot of things, so as far as I could find on the internet, he studied sociology, he studied political science, and he also studied psychology. And he also studied in many countries, so he studied in Kassel and also at Paris 10, Nanterre, so I presume he also speaks French. He received his PhD in sociology in 2013. As a researcher, he has worked at the Hamburg Institute for Social Sciences, the Institute for the History and Future of Work, as well as he was chair of macro-sociology at the University of Kassel. Before taking the position at Humboldt, he was a professor at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. He has focused on the political economy of digitalization and social inequality with relation to digitalization. He focused on leading companies of the commercial internet, such as Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Alibaba, and Tencent, as well as startups. And in 2019, he published the book digitaler Kapitalismus, Markt und Herrschaft in der Ökonomie der Unknappheit, for which he won the Mathöfer Prize for Economic Thinking in 2021. His CV goes on and on and on and on, but I think this gives you an impression of how accomplished he is as a scholar. I don't want to take more time introducing him. I would much rather hand over to you, Professor Staab. You have the floor for about 15 minutes to sort of give us this introduction to your way of thinking about the question of digital capitalism. Does it set us free? Over to you.
Well, hello everybody, and first of all, thanks for having me, and also thanks especially to Zoltán for this very flattering introduction. I'll cut right to the chase. I thought it would be good, maybe sort of as a start off or for our discussion, to maybe develop something like a common understanding of what we might mean when we talk about the digital economy, or in terms of, you know, if it sets us free, questions of inequality and so on, what we could consider digital capitalism to be. So here you see the book that Zoltán already mentioned. It will appear in autumn, I guess, in English, finally, with Manchester University Press. And what I'd say, the few words I'd say today, they are sort of a short introduction into that sort of, into that piece. So maybe as a start, why is there actually something like a debate about what digital capitalism is, or what capitalism, how capitalism might change in terms of it becoming more digital? Well, there is of course a background to that question, which is basically, or which you could start with the secular stagnation hitting Fordist economies, so the developed economies of the sort of transatlantic constellation from the 1970s onwards. You saw a slump in growth back then, and it hasn't really recovered to the levels on which we have built many of our institutions, at least in Western economies. So, of course, there has been a constant search and quest for new poles of growth, new opportunities for innovation, which is basically why you have sort of the rise of digital technologies to be what they are today, the poster children of the sort of rejuvenation of global capitalism. This is particularly true since the 1990s. Some of you might remember the now infamous dot-com boom leading to the dot-com bust. But in particular, the 2010s, so the period after the great financial crisis, we really saw the commercial internet taking off economically, and its leading companies, Alphabet, Meta, Amazon, Apple, rising to being the most valuable companies in the world, also epitomizing a new type, or at least a strong type of concentration of power within the, at least within the digital economy, but also expanding from there, as those companies are highly expensive and they are setting examples for larger contexts in terms of other companies becoming dependent on them, or using them as orientation for what they strive to develop into. But what do they represent on an analytical level? Well, the basic argument I want to make today in this introduction is that they represent a transformation of accumulation patterns. So for people who are not familiar with that type of vocabulary, basically they develop particular, maybe not entirely new, but very particular ways of making money, accumulation, which change or which give them a particular position within the economy. When I think about them as sort of a vanguard of the capitalism to come, I draw on thinking of, for example, Schumpeter, who in his time, in his great monopoly book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, for example, wrote, the best way of getting a vivid and realistic idea of the industrial strategy is indeed to visualize the behavior of new corporations or other industrial entities that introduce new commodities or processes or reorganize a part or the whole of an industry. So there you have it. This is basically how I look at those leading companies of the commercial internet, as them representing a possible pathway into a new type of capitalism. But let's start by looking back first. The rise of those companies and the commercial internet in general has been accompanied by crises. It has not been a smooth rise. In fact, economic crisis has been the major fuel of digital capitalism. I already mentioned the secular stagnation of the post-1970s, which created huge piles of surplus capital, looking for new poles of growth. But in particular, as I said, the dot-com boom in the 90s, we saw a first massive, like a first bigger wave of private investment being channeled into the digital economy. And basically, you could say that the commercial internet was discovered during that period as a distinct economic space with distinct business models, in particular online advertising and e-commerce. Of course, there were also massive investments in digital infrastructures like undersea cables and the like. And of course, at least two of the major corporations of today are founded in that period, namely Amazon and Alphabet, called Google at the time. So what we've seen is really a scenario of massive investment, hype, and crash. We've seen that 20 years ago, and I would argue we are seeing it right now. We've seen a gigantic investment spiral since the great financial crisis of 2008, 9, 10, where valuations have just exploded, not only with the leading companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and so on, but also with digital startups, sort of the satellites circling those bigger corporate planets. But at the same time, already 4 years ago, when IPOs started becoming more important, we had a situation where 80% of the companies going public back then had never made a profit, which was basically the same number as in the year 2000, when the dot-com bubble burst. Now we see rising interest rates, of course, globally, or at least in the West. We see a massive cost of living crisis. And I would argue that not talking about the sort of the big corporations, the Googles and the like, but talking about the periphery of the digital economy, we are probably now seeing a startup mass extinction in the making, as many of these companies depended on cheap loans, cheap money to burn, and will be heavily hit by the fact that consumers will not be able to spend as much as they were in recent years. We've already seen some quite important companies or promising companies going bust, and I expect that to increase. But you could actually ask why we have seen a decade of spectacular speculation within the digital economy. So what is the blueprint, you could say, the promise that made it possible to channel all this money into this particular field? And as I said, I'd argue it is the fact that especially the major companies, they developed a specific pattern of accumulation, which with 5 minutes to go, I'll do it very graphically. It basically looks like this. So what we have to understand is that companies like Amazon or Google, they are not really understood correctly as companies operating on markets. They are better understood as markets on which other companies operate. So look at your phone, whether it is an iPhone or an Android phone, and look, for example, at the App Store. Google and Apple, in that case, they control the entirety of basically the software and the services you can access. And the producers of this software, be it game developers in the Philippines or software producers in Kenya or Hungary or wherever, they are dependent on the rules those companies set. It's very similar to what Amazon can do to third-party vendors on its platform, or basically any transaction platform business model can do to producers. So what those companies did in the period where they rose to power, you could say, is they highly subsidized consumer prices. You do not pay anything for your Google services most of the time, at least money-wise. You ride an Uber taxi, then the fare will be highly subsidized through venture capital. But once those companies try to break even and actually make a profit, what they do is they increase the extraction pressure on the side of producers. So again, picking up on the App Store example, you have an economy where 30% of the revenue that goes through the Google system or through the Apple system or through the Amazon system actually stays with those, you could say, proprietary markets, those markets which are privately owned. So those companies are actually extracting value from the economy. And this might not be sort of such a big issue if there were just many, many small proprietary marketplaces who would be in a situation of competition, bringing down their or hampering their ability to extract money from the broader sphere of producers of work. But this is not the case. What we've seen is that we have a high concentration in basically the companies that I just mentioned, who have moved from being specific marketplaces, say Google being the place you get your information and Amazon being the place where you get your books, to what you could call catch-all markets. So ecosystems through which you can access broadly speaking, all the products that are traded within the commercial internet, and with the commercial internet catching a larger and larger chunk of the overall economy. What we see is actually a propertization, you could say a privatization, but more precisely a propertization of entire markets. I skipped that for time reasons. What you can also see is, if you take a closer look at how those companies do actually operate their market-like platforms, is that they are safeguarding their market function through 4 particular control strategies. So of course they control data or information. This is what is usually stressed as, for example, surveillance of user behavior and so on. But of course it covers not only users, or at least not only consumers, it also covers producers, like those game developers in the Philippines, or those third-party vendors on the Amazon marketplace. And they use this data in order to shape markets. So they work according to what those companies seem fit. They use it to implement access control. So they determine who can actually participate in a market and who cannot. They use it to set prices, or at least control which prices are being charged within their proprietary systems. And they use it to control the performance of all the agents who depend on them, in terms of sometimes a very, very granular type of performance control. Just ask like third-party vendors what they have to do when they want to sell via Amazon. Already heading towards the end with 3 minutes to go. Let us just quickly maybe sort of try to catch a glimpse on what such a system would mean for questions of power and social inequality. I argue that it actually constitutes a logic or a dynamic of a dual expropriation of labor. How so? Well, the first argument I basically already delivered. Think about an economy that is structured like the commercial internet, or think of the commercial internet. What you have is a system within which 30%, roughly speaking, 30% of the profits made within a particular market, they do not go back to producers. They cannot be redistributed in wages, but they stay with those market-owning companies. It means they can pay very high salaries to their few employees, but it also means that the broader part of the economy becomes increasingly dependent on their systems, lacks those 30% in order for purposes of distribution, for example. So the first mechanism creating social inequality in this context is one of rent extraction. The second one, you could say, is a bit more, well, you could take a lot of time exemplifying it, and I won't do that. Maybe if you're interested, we can do it in the discussion. Well, what you basically see is that in the labor market, within sort of broadly speaking, the world of dependent labor, we see the rise of algorithmic management systems. So digital systems that are used to basically control labor. And when you ask how they control labor within the digital labor process, what you see is basically that those 4 control strategies that proprietary markets use in order to control market participants, they are now used within the digital labor process. Data control, for example, via tracking, when you track behavior of employees through digital variables or the like. Access control, when you take this data and create individual ratings and then say, well, you can only access a certain position within the company if you have such and such score, which then also determines wages, right? So price control, and is basically based on the on information asymmetries when it comes to data from the labor process. So basically, you see sort of the situation of digital markets being mirrored within the digital labor process. And this is the last slide. So I was asked to say a few things on what this implies for certain questions, and I didn't list all of them right now, but I'm sure we can get to them within the discussion. So first of all, when we think about what is the digital economy, what is digital capitalism, I'd say, well, it isn't a logic of the accumulation of power through the propertization of entire markets. This is what I'd say is at least one of the very, very important aspects of it. And when we ask what this implies for the question of whether the digitalization of the economy will deliver the growth we expect from it, then an argument to make would, of course, be that it is up to now strongly linked to crisis and also strongly linked to very, very strong asymmetries of power. And the economic model that really prevails, so this model of proprietary markets, this is a predatory business model. This is not a model that is sort of creating growth, broadly speaking. It is a model that is preying on the profits of other companies. This is at least the argument I want to put forward today. I was also asked to say a few words about sustainability, and there are many more words to say about that than the ones I'll do now. We can maybe do that in the discussion. But what we can also, I think, draw from what I just said is that platforms, the way I described them, they are drivers of overconsumption. They profit from increasing consumption because they tax every transaction on the market. So of course, they're not a solution to sustainability the way they operate right now. They are part of the problem, not part of the solution. And if you think more broadly about sustainability, not only ecologically, but also socially, then of course, with digital capitalism and being a driver of social inequality, this is also something that contradicts sustainability issues. However, and also something we could elaborate on, I do see in recent years political contestations against, in particular, what I described as digital capitalism are increasing. We are already, however, we are not at the point yet where we could say what the definite results for the shape of digital capitalism in the future might be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Staab. I think you gave us an excellent overview of your ideas about this question, and thank you very much for keeping to the agreed time, especially, which gives us a lot of opportunities to ask questions, which I would already like to encourage the audience to do. So if you have questions, once again, either you type them into the chat box, in which case I will input it into the discussion, or if you raise your questions with the raise hand button, then we'll give you the floor. While you're thinking, while you're making up your mind about the questions, I would like to kick off this discussion with a question. I was listening to you with the original question in my head. So the original question was, does digital capitalism set us free? And I don't want to ask you what you think about it, because I think it's pretty obvious from what you were saying that your answer was most likely to be negative. That you seem to imply that it does not set us free, as opposed to the original promise of 30, 40 years ago, where this promise was made. And you basically talked about firms getting captured, labor getting captured, and in a subtle way, you also hinted about politics getting captured. So you're more likely to answer in the negative. But what I was also thinking about as I was listening to you was, is this natural? Has this been a natural process? So this sort of monopolization of these markets and the proprietary marketization, as you describe it. So basically these firms becoming markets and capturing entire markets. So it's not simply just monopolies, but they've effectively captured these markets entirely, which is more than just simply a monopolization. Has this been a natural process, or was this something which was an intentional drive towards this sort of unique position, which was engineered somehow through regulation, through God knows what other processes? I'm very curious what you think about it. Whether any of this, some people make the argument that, you know, these are natural monopolies. I'm curious if you also think that.
Well, I mean, first of all, and more broadly speaking, when you think about technology, as a sociologist, there's never anything natural about anything. This is why I'm not talking about digital, sort of the nature of the digital, but about digital capitalism. So under capitalist imperatives, what those technologies have developed into was something that was there as an opportunity, and there were sort of, you could say, smart agents, smart actors who were able to grab that opportunity and use it. But of course, digital technologies do have potentials to set us free, whatever that is supposed to mean, just not under the proprietary and, bluntly said, capitalist conditions they are used in this regard. In terms of monopolization, it is quite well established that there are some aspects to digital monopolies that are particular to them being digital, or at least platforms, digital platforms, which is, for example, what is in research coined as network effect. So when you think about the question why basically all important social media platforms within, say, the transatlantic constellation are owned by one particular company, Meta or Facebook, then one answer to that is, well, because once Meta managed to have a critical mass of users, it just became sort of unnecessary, even sort of bad decisions for users to use any other platform. So they have those network effects where once they reach a critical mass, which they can by simply drawing on the huge amounts of venture capital that they in this particular decade or the last 2 decades could catch, to then expand their user base almost without sort of much further input. There is also the aspect that many of the products that those companies deal in, they are digital themselves, which means they are what you could say super abundant, right? You can copy them with a mouse click, basically. So what they can do is, because of that, is they can scale very quickly. It doesn't really cost Google anything to onboard another person or another 1,000 persons to Android, or it doesn't cost Meta really anything to onboard 1,000 or 5,000 people to Facebook or WhatsApp, because those goods they trade in, they are just not scarce the way natural resources or cars or just basically any other product is. But then on the other side, there is, as you already mentioned, also regulation, which is contingent. So especially when you look at social media, there is the secular US legislation, which enabled those companies to basically not be responsible for any content that they acquired through user behavior and on which they build their services. And this is something, when we talk about the future of digital capitalism, we are obviously trying to slowly step away from. So we had, for example, a few years ago, a law in Germany before we went into the process of creating European law, where you try to get some type of accountability for, fake news and so on within social media. The way I perceived it, it was sort of a stepping stone for European legislation, in particular the Digital Services Act, which at least tries at this point in time to step away from the self-regulation of those companies. So they're not supposed to police themselves entirely and then say, oops, we fucked up, but we're very sorry. But there are oversight bodies supposed to be there. And I mean, maybe we'll talk about that later a bit more, of course. We do not really know yet how those oversight bodies will work and which impact they will have at the end of the day.
Okay. I would still like to encourage people in the audience to join in and ask questions. But I do have two follow-up questions. One of them is you started off saying you don't really believe in natural monopolies or anything happening. But then you said, okay, if Facebook reaches a critical mass, then basically it doesn't really make sense to be on more Facebooks or different Facebooks. So if you were on one Facebook, I was on another Facebook, then we couldn't really communicate. So isn't that sort of a natural monopoly that we need to be on one Facebook, because otherwise it just doesn't make sense? That's the first question. And the second one is, how do you set yourself free of these? Because it was often raised that basically, the whole thing about sharing economy, platform economy, it started off also with this sort of very positive promises of people being able to use these technologies to create themselves jobs, and the world being flat, Thomas Friedman and all of that, with now everybody, anybody anywhere in the world can reach anybody else. And if you can use those platforms. And then we ended up with this very negative scenario of basically sharing economy platforms being once again monopolized by large global firms. But then the question was raised, so why does it have to happen? Why does it have to happen that way? Why does Deliveroo or Uber or someone like that have to control that? Why can't taxi drivers create their own platforms? And why can't taxi drivers run their own platforms? Why does it always become a large multinational corporation which ends up controlling these? Why can't small people control these bottom up?
Yeah, two great questions. So as I said, or as I tried to say at least, yes, there are some aspects to why you could frame them as natural monopolies. But then on the other side, those tendencies, they're only there because we organized and structured the commercial internet in a particular way. So there is no natural necessity to Facebook or Google operating the way it does. If you think about network effects, which you really basically discovered in economics, trying to make sense of those companies' rise to power. What you see is that there is also an alternative idea, for example, which goes by the umbrella term interoperability. So you could describe social media or messaging, communication platforms, and so on, historically as a step backwards. So when I was a kid and there was no WhatsApp and no social media and so on, I could pick up the phone and I could call basically everybody in the world. No, I'm young enough to be, post 1990s when I pick up this phone, but these were interoperable systems. So I could call someone in Australia. Now I cannot text to someone who doesn't use WhatsApp, but uses Signal or any other type of messenger. So the big idea on the market when it comes to regulation and tackling those sort of problems now is that, well, why do we not have a common standard that those companies have to use in order to bring us back to the 1990s when I could just call or text anyone I wanted, So there really isn't any natural necessity to those logins. It just so happened that those companies were smart enough to implement the situation where they could create those network effects. And well, unfortunately, they're moving much quicker than political regulation. So they are at least a decade ahead. But we started making sense of how they operate, and there are at least some ideas on how to tackle this sort of problem. While, of course, and this is, I think, sort of ideologically speaking, a very interesting aspect within this whole situation. Of course, there are actors within the global economy, nation states basically, who have a strong interest in the centralization of communication, because it enables them to develop tools of surveillance that are not as easy put in place when you have more decentralized systems. So it's really sort of interestingly, the liberal spectrum within the West, somehow even the neoliberals, who take issue with the fact that we are now moving into a world where markets cannot, with any type of in any sense of the world, be called free. They're not. This is just not what this is. The proprietary markets are exactly the opposite. So it's very interesting how, if you look at the EU, for example, their push against those digital monopolies is very much motivated by something like sort of a neoliberal position, which imagines itself to be sort of in the defensive. So what they think of themselves, we're now the counter-hegemonic neoliberalism, fighting for real and free markets. And then again, you have a situation where sort of the imaginations of what you can do with those companies, with those technologies and with those digital platforms, they shift between those two, like bluntly speaking, terrible poles, like hyper real markets or technocratic concentration of power. And there's not really any drive behind, second question, behind the models that you just stressed. So when I say at the end, will I see increasing contestation of that? Of course, I think about the counter-hegemonic neoliberalism within the EU, but I also think about, say, platform cooperatives. So worker or labor-owned platforms who deliver similar or even the same services, say bike couriers in Berlin, food delivery, co-ops in New York or whatever. And they do not work on the basis of, the shareholders want the biggest cut, but they operate on the basis of every worker is a stakeholder. So there is no sucking out 30% of the profits from those markets. What is the problem with that? Well, there are two problems. The first problem is, and I'm very sorry to be so sort of trivial or even banal in a sense, but I mean, they do not get the venture capital. They cannot scale. How should they do it? It's like there's just no one puts money into cooperatives. So that's a basic problem. But when I drive to Budapest and I get out of the train station, I do not want to find out what the local platform is. I want to use whatever global platform I know from my last trip to wherever. So this is a huge problem. And the second problem, and it's something we really have to think hard about, I think, is I was not joking when I said we're in the middle of we might be at the beginning of a startup mass extinction. all those business models that you just mentioned, ride sharing with Uber, food delivery, like the whole gig economy, none of those companies, or almost none of those companies, are making profits. And they haven't done so for the better part of a decade. So, I mean, they're growing quickly, but they burn money. This is what they do. So once they do not get new investments, they're out of business. And what you basically do is when you operate such a construction in a cooperative, is you socialize losses with the labor that owns this platform, instead of at least keeping those losses to the venture capital investors there. So then again, this puts us in sort of politically in this, at least for me, uncomfortable spot where, well, yes, like the EU and sort of the big regulatory push, this is what we have to work with. And this is where at least some power sits that could at least have some sort of interest in creating something else than the digital economy we're having.
And why don't we do something about it? Because it seems to me from what you're saying that this would be a natural place for the left and the right to work together, because the political left hates large corporations and overpower anyway, so it's natural for them to act. And as you said yourself, the neoliberal right professes markets and competition. And if you can prove, and this I think is pretty obvious, you don't even have to do much to prove it, that there is no competition there, then they would also, at least, theoretically, on a rhetorical level, they would also push towards more competition. And as you say, interoperability would enable more firms to take part. So much like there would be different Facebooks with interoperability, you could also regulate, let's say, sharing economy. So when you do arrive at the railway station in Budapest, you would have one app, but through that one app, you could reach the local platform. So that would enable sort of cooperatives and bottom-up initiatives to sort of join into an interoperable network in a way, but this would need regulation. But I would say, I would feel that this would be a great place for left and the right to meet and to finally do something about it. Why don't we do that?
Well, I think you could say there are at least two reasons. One reason is that, you have to imagine the rise to power of the commercial internet as happening within a situation where in most countries that we are talking about now, you did at least have real wage stagnation. So it's what the situation we had since the great financial crisis is one where companies rise to power, which are on the economic side of things in the business of subsidizing consumption. They give us all those free services. All they want is our data. So, and this is a great deal for people who have, feel like they have less money in their pocket. So why would they fight the only company who, gives them taxi rides that only cost half the price of the former, local monopoly taxi operator? Why would they fight companies who give them all those nice digital services for free, without which they cannot even navigate within the city anymore? So on the one hand, you are right. They are, with being big and dominant corporations, they are the ideal target of a right-wing and left-wing sort of anti-capitalist notion. And people have tried that, there have been attempts to politicize their market power. Also, at least in the last 4 to 5 years, I'd say, since The Economist started the debate around the so-called tech clash. And the second reason, but those contestations, they have sort of hit this wall of users not sort of understanding properly why they should, hate those companies in particular. And the second reason I think why we are stuck with the liberal or at least borderline neoliberal approach to regulation is basically that we're in a situation of intellectual bankruptcy when it comes to thinking about what you could use those companies for. And Zoltán, you know, I sympathize a lot with what you said, with the idea, and there are dynamics. We're having projects, research projects on that in Berlin, with, for example, public companies who have mobility as a service platform. So say the public transport provider in Berlin or Budapest offers an app within which you can look for all the directions, book tickets, and so on, this type of platform. And maybe it might even include, you know, like ride sharing and e-scooters and whatever, but it's controlled by a public entity. And then you connect those public entities to the ones, this local entity to the one in Berlin and to the one in Paris. And you do not have the problem that I had when I entered Budapest anymore. But this, again, is the idea of creating a proper market, you know? I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't. I would say, well, maybe the idea of having, maybe the distinction between public goods and a notion of expanding public goods is the best shot at the situation we're having at this point in time. So saying, well, those companies, they have become more and more semi-public entities necessary to conduct life that we deem normal in societies like ours. So they have to be regulated like distributors of public goods, basically. And then you have a political impetus on shaping those particular markets. And you can think about a whole lot of things, I would say. Not only about how to make it more convenient for users, even though we definitely have already lost when we take steps back in that direction and people will just not use these services, but also in terms of, you know, like how you use those quasi-public digital services in order to steer economic and political or social development into a direction that we see fit as a democracy. You know, how can we use public transport platforms or transport platforms in general in order to advance more ecological transportation systems, more democratic healthcare systems, and so on and so on.
Okay, we still have about 10 minutes left, so I would like to encourage the audience, both in the chat box and if you want to ask a direct question, the raise your hand function. While you're thinking, one last question, and I really just like to push it a little bit further, because I completely buy your argument that as consumers, we are not so worried. So as consumers, we actually enjoy the benefits of having a free service, a relatively good service, etc. So I see why consumers are not worried, but we're not only consumers, we are also labor. So a lot of us, you know, are exposed and controlled by these platforms. We are also firms. So if we want to start our little enterprises, then you immediately get captured by these markets, which, as you say, have been appropriated by these large corporations. We are also political entities. And, you know, this might not be a huge problem in Germany, where it's a more democratic state, but in countries where you have the cooperation between the local political authority and the large corporation, we have plenty of examples of this. Google cooperating with China, Vodafone being switched off in Egypt, Erdogan in Turkey shutting off Twitter and controlling, you know, many countries controlling Facebook to a large degree, and very often with the cooperation of these large enterprises. So the literature on digital capitalism is full of examples of this sort of political curtailment of rights where these corporations act. So if we are politically affected, if we are affected as in terms of competition as firms and often as labor, is it the fact that this is too little? So on one end of the spectrum, you have, or sort of one weight, you have our benefits as consumers, which outweigh somehow the negative impact that we experience as entrepreneurs, voters, or startup firms. Is it the case that it's simply we value more, or there are more of us valuing the benefits that arise? Because if this is the case, then we have accepted, to me it seems we have accepted the sort of neoliberal argument that, hey, look, at the end of the day, what is the problem? People are enjoying these services, they're okay with it. Is that the case, that those neoliberals who say, well, look, these are fantastic services, there might be problems, but at the end of the day, people like this as it is. Is that the case?
Well, you could say the longer you've told people that they have to think of themselves as consumers for 4 decades now, and at some point in time they did, yes. So in a way, yes. I mean, it's really, like I'm sort of attached biographically and so on to organized labor. But as a sociologist, even in Germany, the country where you have the most powerful union of the world with the IG Metall, which is very successful in terms of navigating globalization and so on and so on. Even here, organized labor is in ruins. So, I mean, what can one person do as a consumer, and what can one person do as a worker? Not much. What you need is the institutions that organize collective interests collectively. And those institutions we have lost in a way if we had them. And
what's stopping a trade union from organizing digitally? I mean, one would think, and this is what we thought decades ago, that if the network effects and the internet effects give power to the business side, to the corporations, then by the same token, it would also help the organization of the labor side.
Yeah, no, I mean, they are trying to organize platform companies from the startup economy and the gig economy upwards, even to Google and Amazon. What we see is that, like in Germany, we had for really many, many years, constant labor struggles at Amazon. They haven't really led anywhere. It was like the service workers union, they burned a lot of money, but there are no results. With gig workers, people organized, the people who organized companies like Deliveroo and so on, they were organizers that were not attached to real unions. Those were syndicalists, and like they did it in their free time basically, and they did it within companies who are not profitable. And these are all sort of the fallacies, which are part of that. I really I'm personally at the point where with all the bad words you can find for the EU's approach to the situation. At least we're at the point now where this situation is taken seriously, and there is a big push of regulation. Am I hyper optimistic about the outcomes of that? Probably not, but at least things are moving. And once things are moving, something is happening. So this is, this is basically the point where I'm at right now. There have been attempts of organizing also out of IG Metall and other stronger unions, but those are more like showcases, of what they do. The interests that they are really safeguarding are the ones of the highly organized workforces, chemical industry, automotive industry, of course. And I'd even say that probably the real battles are fought there, but again, not in terms of, strikes and organizing and so on, but more in terms of the digital network car, who will own the software. You have this thing where Volkswagen now basically burned their CEO, Dies, because he insisted on Volkswagen delivering its own operating system for the next generation of Volkswagen cars, instead of going with Google like many other car manufacturers. And it seems like even Volkswagen, the biggest car manufacturer in the world, isn't really able to do that. You know, like they might be able to do that at the end of the day at some point, but at this point in time, it's just, it's a mess, you know? And I think this just shows in a way how battles are fought within industry, not especially within, you know, the small firms, but more in terms of the representatives of, you know, like the old capitalist class, which needs to rejuvenate in order not to perish, and those new agents. And it will be very interesting to see, you know, you have all those large corporations now. Volkswagen and Amazon are building a cloud together. BMW and Microsoft are doing the same thing. Who's calling the shots here? Who's profiting from what? Is it a rip-off of the old industries, or are they managing to craft new business models that could then be used as blueprints for other parts of the economy? It's up in the open, really.
Okay, one last question, if I may. It comes from András Lázár, who wants to ask you about taxation and these large digital companies. It's also an issue that not only are they monopolistic, but they also are very good at avoiding taxation.
Yeah, they are, definitely. I mean, this is the first shot people wanted to, or politics wanted to take at them. And unfortunately, it was also Scholz, as our chancellor now, when he was finance minister, who did not advance it, even though there was a window of opportunity. I'm very optimistic that we'll get a global digital tax at some point in time, or at least almost global. But, you know, like those companies, they have so much money. This is just, you know, like a little redistribution won't cut it. The questions of power that arise from this particular type of company is who controls markets in the digital age. And we're in the process of trying at least to find new arrangements for a democratic control of markets. And we'll see where that takes us. The political class we're having.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time, but I'll give the audience a last chance to ask questions. So either in the chat box or by raising your hands, if there's anyone who wants to ask a very last question, you still have a chance to do that. Counting back, 3, 2, 1. Okay, there don't seem to be more questions. There is one question. József Veres. Can we please give the floor to József Veres? József, I think the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me. My question is very simple. That kind of concentration can go still forward upon your understanding, or could it be any kind of natural limit of that over concentration of the power and the economic capacities of these companies?
Well, theoretically, great question. Theoretically speaking, there are not really limits to it, because, or at least there is just still so much of the economy to be integrated and made dependable on those platform companies. I do, however, not believe that this is what we'll see. This is not what will happen at least within Europe. The situation we're having right now politically is one where, in a way, there is a dual strategy. All the regulation that is put forward is basically there to contain the further expansion of those companies. It will not be able to contain it entirely, but it is there, but at least that's the goal. And the idea is that once we contain this as good as we can, there is time for innovation within, you know, Germany's Industry 4.0 or new types of renewables and so like other markets for European companies to flourish. And this is a very pragmatic strategy. It basically, I would argue, at the end of the day, it goes back to, you know, and this is paradoxic in a way to the interests of German export industries. You know, like we cannot really, there is no socializing Amazon in Europe or socializing Google in Europe. Because once we do that, we, you know, like the Germans, they won't sell cars in the US anymore. But this is not negotiable for us, for them. So we basically stuck with this dual strategy of trying to do as much containment as WTO rules and so on allow for, and at the same time trying to foster digital innovation and other types of innovation in other fields. And we'll have to see where it takes us.
Okay, thank you very much, Joseph, for the question. And that brings us to the end of our session today. I'm very happy that we had the opportunity to discuss these issues, because I think we're all thinking about this in our everyday lives as we encounter these large digital firms. There's no exception to this rule nowadays. I think every single one of us is faced with these questions. And finally, we got a chance to discuss with someone who actually studies these professionally. So Professor Philipp Staab, thank you very much indeed for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much for listening, at least.
And so this is going to go online. I'd like to thank those of you who have joined us, the audience. This is going to go online. So I encourage you, if you know someone who would also be interested, to share the video of the conversation. And I'd like to thank the two interpreters, Daniel and Otto. I'd like to thank Gábor Péter for organizing and for the cooperation with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung János Molnár, especially. Once again, Dr. Philipp Staab, thank you very much. Thank you. Good night.